When the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in 1825, primarily to speed up the transportation of coal between the collieries and the coast, few could have foreseen the impact that this relatively short journey would have on the rapidly advancing Industrial Revolution. Although the track was initially laid out to accommodate horse-drawn traffic, the engineer of the line had some very innovative and exciting ideas in development. The engineer was George Stephenson, the uneducated son of a colliery fireman from Northumberland, who is listed in the Dictionary of National Biography as being the inventor and founder of railways. Born in 1781, Stephenson's lack of schooling didn't hinder his interest in engineering, and he quickly learned his future trade working with the steam engines commonly used in the pits for pumping and winding. Stephenson became convinced that the steam locomotive was the railway's future, and he built his first prototype in 1814. At the Stockton and Darlington, his Locomotion hauled the inaugural train. However, the bulk of the passenger trade continued to travel in horse-drawn carriages. When George Stephenson was subsequently appointed as engineer for the Liverpool to Manchester Railway in 1826, he was presented with an opportunity to put his theories to the test. The directors of the company suggested the use of stationary engines and rope haulage, which Stephenson vehemently opposed. In 1829, the directors staged the Rainhill trials to see whether a locomotive could be found that was capable of meeting their requirements. A prize of £500 was offered, and 5 locomotives were entered. Stephenson and his son Robert built a locomotive especially for the trials. Appropriately named the Rocket, it was the convincing winner, reaching a world record speed of 30 miles per hour. Consequently, when the Liverpool to Manchester line opened in 1830, steam locomotives were used exclusively. The venture was a success from the outset, with the line carrying more passengers than had ever been expected, and as a result, the great railway revolution developed rapidly over just a few short years. With an efficient transport system in place, both Liverpool and Manchester benefited greatly. Manchester rapidly became the cotton capital of the country, and it soon became evident that the industrial districts of Lancashire and Yorkshire needed to be linked by railway, as the towns of Halifax, Bradford and Leeds developed with the growing woolen and textile industries. There was, however, one major obstacle in the way of the developers once they had reached Manchester, namely the Pennines. Known to many from vaguely remembered geography lessons as the backbone of England, this range of hills certainly presented the Manchester and Leeds Railway with a major challenge. George Stephenson's reputation had grown dramatically in stature, and this made him the obvious choice as engineer for the line. Today, the modern railway traveller may not necessarily notice the great feats of engineering that Stephenson came up with to traverse the Pennines, but the influence of the great engineer can still be seen, and this programme will follow in Stephenson's tracks from Manchester to Bradford. As a modern city, Manchester has a very popular claim to fame thanks to Manchester United's high profile in the world of football. In an atmosphere where footballers enjoy celebrity status, Manchester is home to that other great manufacturer of celebrity, the soap opera. Granada Studios have become one of the nation's major tourist attractions, with crowds of visitors taking a stroll down Coronation Street in search of fictional characters that have become a part of the British way of life. Further investigation is definitely worthwhile and will uncover evidence of the great prosperity brought to Manchester by the railways and the cotton industry. The glorious neo-Gothic town hall, which was built in 1875, is a celebration of Manchester's status as the cotton capital of Britain. Even the Great Royal Exchange Theatre holds a clue in the name to its original occupation as the Cotton Exchange, with the world cotton prices on the day that it was closed still displayed. To travel from Manchester to Bradford by train, passengers need to set off from Manchester's Victoria Station. When the line was first in operation, the southern terminus was on the Oldham Road, but when it was decided to join the line to Stephenson's very well established Liverpool and Manchester, a diversion was made to Hunt's Bank, with a new station opened on the 1st of January 1844, named after the young Queen, Victoria. There were major difficulties because by this time the two lines were managed by different railway companies at either end of an 850-foot long platform. Government inspectors condemned the station as bad and dangerous, and by 1884 a new station called Exchange was opened at the western end for passengers from the Liverpool line. Unfortunately, if they wanted to travel on towards Leeds, there was a quarter of a mile walk to join the Lancashire and Yorkshire ongoing train. Exchange Station is now closed, and much of Victoria's striking facade was created when William Dawes redesigned it in 1909. His brief was to make it more imposing, and the iron and glass canopy displaying destinations as far afield as the continent certainly gives the building an air of expectancy. Overall, though, it has to be said that despite modern-day attempts to clean the stonework, the general impression is that of dilapidation, not helped by the outlook onto one of Manchester's less than salubrious quarters. George Stephenson's first plan for this line was submitted in 1825, and it involved many steep climbs and long tunnels, which was modified in 1830 to an easier route that was rather winding but required no tunnels. His third attempt, and the chosen option of 1835, was far more direct, with few steep gradients but 8 tunnels, one of which needed to be over 1.5 miles in length. It was a personal triumph for Stephenson, as he firmly believed that sharp gradients should be resisted wherever possible, and despite the rising contours of the Pennines, there are only 2 substantial stretches of line which rise at a steeper gradient than 1 in 200. Victoria Station lies at a low level, and the start of the journey is by necessity a steep climb. When the line first opened, there was a stationary engine used to take the trains up to Miles Platting, but very quickly the locomotives coped with the climb under their own steam. Today, the train to Bradford avoids Miles Platting with a deviation that was opened in 1877 to Thorpe's Bridge Junction, where it rejoins Stephenson's line for the next 28 miles. The line continues to climb towards Rochdale, with the scenery becoming ever more dramatic. By the time the train passes through Castleton, built above the much-visited Blue John Caves, Mam Tor, better known as the Shivering Mountain, can be seen to the northwest. The name is due to several landslides, quite an alarming prospect in this type of terrain. The ruined Peveril Castle dates back to 1086 and was immortalised by Sir Walter Scott in his novel Peveril of the Peak. At this point, the railway follows the Rochdale Canal, which was in fact the first canal to cross the Pennines. This was one of the principal works of William Jessop, and despite the obvious decline when the railway offered a quicker alternative, the canal competed effectively for business. The canal was in working use right up until 1937, and there are parts of the canal which are still well maintained today. The first stop is Rochdale, at a station that is slightly out of the town centre. The Pennine foothills rise majestically all around, but sadly most of the fine late Victorian station that graced this site has been demolished, only to be replaced by an insignificant modern construction. Rochdale itself, however, is full of historical interest, with its main claim to fame as the birthplace of the cooperative movement in 1844, where it was founded by the Rochdale pioneers in Toad Lane. The Victorian Gothic Town Hall is of similar style to the one seen in Manchester, and it is perhaps one of the finest examples of its type to be found in Britain. The scenery, as the line starts to carve its way through the Pennines, must have been quite staggering for the early travellers. There was definitely an element of trepidation attached to the journey, particularly as the 19th century media reflected the views of the average man, who was not at all convinced about the safety of the new technology. Matters were not helped by the disaster that occurred at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway by the Duke of Wellington in 1830, when William Huskisson, a Member of Parliament, was run over and killed by Stephenson's rocket. The press, needless to say, reported the event extensively due to the high public profile of all concerned, and it's interesting to note some of the other contemporary theories about railway travel that were widely publicised in the newspapers. It was a commonly held belief that passengers would be suffocated in the tunnels and made nervous wrecks by the noise. The appalling speeds reached would cause passengers to become both blind and deaf. The stones on the track would undoubtedly wreck the trains, and cinders from the engine would set fire to cornfields and woodland, with grazing animals left terrified out of their senses by noise, smoke and sparks. If this wasn't sufficiently damning, the passengers' moral souls were also in danger should they commit the terrible sin of travelling on a Sunday. In 1841, a poster appeared offering a reward for Sabbath breaking, declaring that passengers would be taken safely and swiftly to hell next Lord's Day by the Carlisle Railway for 7 shillings and 6pence. Despite the reported dangers, the railway flourished, and all of the towns on this journey grew in direct proportion to the improved transport system. Once past Rochdale, the gradient flattens out a little as the train heads for one of the most dramatic features on this journey. After a 2-mile stretch of level track, the train starts the steady climb up to Summit Tunnel, stopping at Smithy Bridge, which is a new station replacing an earlier one that was closed in 1960. The train then travels just a short distance to the next stop, carried on a stone viaduct through the centre of Littleborough, where the station gives pride of place to a plaque commemorating the opening of the line from Manchester in 1839. As the train approaches Summit Tunnel, the line runs through a narrow rocky pass, side by side with both the canal and the Todmorden Road. It's a great shame that the entrances to the tunnel today are blackened by years of use, and it's difficult to imagine how glorious this opening in the rock would have looked with the arms of the Manchester and Leeds carved above it. The construction of the tunnel took 3¼ years to complete, between 1837 and 1841. Up until the building of the Summit Tunnel, George Stephenson's son Robert had been responsible for the longest tunnel, the Kilsby on the London to Birmingham Railway, measuring 2,426 yards. Summit, on completion, measured a magnificent 2,885 yards, but this claim to fame was short-lived, as that other engineering son of a famous engineering father, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, completed his box tunnel on the Great Western Railway just 4 months later, outdoing Summit, measuring 3,212 yards. There was another tunnel being constructed through the Pennines at this time at a place called Woodhead between Manchester and Sheffield. This tunnel measured 5,302 yards, but it did take 7 years to build, opening at the end of 1845. Isambard Kingdom Brunel was born in 1806, 2½ years after Robert Stephenson in 1803. The two men were often in direct competition as engineers for rival railway companies. Robert's father had ensured that his son received the formal education he had missed out on before teaching him all there was to know about engineering. Sir Mark Brunel, Isambard's father, was also a famous engineer, and he, like Stephenson, taught his son from his own experiences. This may well have been the basis for an affinity between Robert and Isambard, because they certainly respected each other's work, even when they differed in opinion, as in the case of width of track, more commonly known as gauge. The Stephensons had used the narrow gauge as dictated by the average width of farm carts on the first horse-drawn railways. Brunel chose a 7-foot broad gauge based upon engineering calculations for his rapidly growing Great Western Line, and was sadly disappointed when an Act of Parliament decided that the narrow gauge should be the uniform width throughout the country, and today's standard gauge is the legacy of George Stephenson's original calculations based on farm carts. The two men remained close all of their lives, which were both shortened by overwork and stress. Brunel died at the age of 53 in September 1859, and Robert Stephenson died a month later in October, just 4 days before his 56th birthday. The health of both men had been destroyed many years earlier, and they shared a last meeting dining together on Christmas Day 1858 out in Egypt, where they were both involved in engineering projects. Once into Summit Tunnel, which is driven through millstone grit lined with brickwork and cement, few passengers will realise just how hard it was to construct a feature of this nature safely in the late 1830s. Miners and bricklayers worked around the clock, as many as 1,000 at a time, earning 6 shillings and sixpence for a 10-hour day. Hardly surprising, therefore, that the costings went way over budget, taking the total to £251,000 against the original estimate of £156,800. The tunnel work hit difficulties in December 1840 as it was nearing completion, when part of the track collapsed. Rumours flew back to Manchester, and soon the story claimed that the entire tunnel had caved in, burying many of the workmen beneath the rubble. George Stephenson and a party of directors immediately went out to inspect the damage and were delighted to discover the minor degree of damage, and more importantly, that there had been no loss of life. Stephenson quickly realised what had caused the problem and calculated the adjustments necessary to restore the track, and confidently made a formal statement guaranteeing the safety of the tunnel. He said, "I'll stake my character, my head, if that tunnel was ever to give way so as to cause danger to any of the public passing under it. I don't think there's such another piece of work in the world." Brave words that the passage of time has proved justified, with the tunnel only closed for repair in 1985, and although part of that work was dealing with over a century of wear and tear, most of the restoration was required because of a fire that had broken out on a train whilst underground. During the course of the tunnel, the train passes from Lancashire into Yorkshire, emerging to descend through the gorge of the River Calder, winding its way through villages and industrial buildings on its route towards Todmorden. This town was well known for its cotton mills, and it presented a number of obstacles for the railway to negotiate. 2 large bridges were needed to cross the canal, and in the first instance this was achieved by means of the Goxholm Viaduct. The iron span which takes the train across looks rather strange, built on the skew and joined to a very striking castle-like turret. The second bridge is less ornate, crossing the canal at the southern edge of the town, and is part of the Todmorden Viaduct. The railway is carried over 9 arches through Todmorden, where this train makes its 4th stop. As this train carries on towards Halifax, there's a branch line that breaks off to climb through Cliviger Gorge to Burnley and Preston. Opened in 1849, the line was then closed for many years, before reinstating a passenger service in 1985. 3 miles out of Todmorden at Charleston, Stephenson's engineers encountered a sandy hill in terrain that was too unstable to take the tunnel that had been planned. Consequently, they curved the line around the hill, but the design was responsible for a terrible accident in 1912, when a Manchester to Bradford express train hauled by a 242 tank engine became derailed at high speed, resulting in the deaths of 4 passengers. The Yorkshire landscape presented many difficulties, not least at this point in the journey the choice of where to place stations along the very narrow Calder Valley. After Todmorden, the line descends towards Sowerby Bridge, passing through some historically interesting stations. At Hebden Bridge, this train's next stop, the original station was rebuilt in 1909. The turn-of-the-century building has a very nostalgic feel to it, and great care has been taken to restore and maintain the station since British Rail completed the very sympathetic renovation work in 1985. Hebden Bridge itself is an attractive town constructed of old stone where Hebden Water meets the River Calder. The town's name comes from the old Packhorse Bridge, which was built in 1510, which of course made this an important crossing point. The steep, cobbled Packhorse route is still in existence and known as the Buttress. It leads up to Heptonstall, which grew up as a weaver's village. Hebden Bridge also has another claim to fame, because it has the only factory in Britain today appropriately named Walkleys that still produces clogs. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, the factory workers of northern England became synonymous with clogs, which were no doubt the most sensible and economic form of footwear available at the time. The countryside here is a dramatic mixture of wild open moorland and blackened, cramped industrial conurbation. To the north of Hebden Bridge, the passenger is treated to beautiful views of Hardcastle Crags, where 400 acres of woodland has been preserved with mill ponds and riverside walks. Moving away from Hebden Bridge, the line continues its descent, stopping next at Mytholmroyd, where the station was built in part over a viaduct with a subway connecting the platforms that was actually constructed beneath one of the arches. The building, as seen today, is surprisingly tall for a station and very narrow, incorporating 5 flights of stairs. It's a pleasant station for travellers to stop at because, just as at Hebden Bridge, considerable work has gone into restoration and refurbishment. From the train at this point in the journey, at the surrounding Yorkshire countryside, passengers are confronted by a bleak yet stunningly beautiful landscape that is often referred to as Bronte country. The world-famous Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, who wrote their dramatic and haunting novels just a few miles from here at Haworth, immortalised this wild place for all time. The Brontes would have been well aware of the new trends in railway travel, and despite the changes that transport brought to the area, the striking views seen today have altered little with the passing of time. A short detour will find the Keighley and Worth Valley Steam Railway still running through Haworth today, taking visitors on steam journeys up and down this traditionally colourful branch line, which was actually used for filming of that great family favourite, The Railway Children. Back to the railway journey being taken today, and the train passes through the now closed station at Ludden Foot before arriving at Sowerby Bridge. Although there's no direct link by track to the Keighley and Worth Valley line, there is nevertheless an interesting association. Few people are aware that there was a Bronte brother who, after failing in his attempts as a schoolteacher, tried his luck on the railway. In an atmosphere very similar to the one experienced on the Keighley and Worth Valley of the present day, Branwell Bronte worked at both Ludden Foot and Sowerby Bridge stations. The Bronte family must have been very relieved that brother Branwell was not employed at Haworth Station, because he was dismissed from his post as clerk in charge of Ludden Foot due to financial irregularities, and as his father was vicar at Haworth, this could have proved very embarrassing. The young man did soon after this episode come to a very bad end, mainly due to his fondness for opium and gin, evidently the ultimate destination for the railway company's missing funds. Just beyond Sowerby Bridge, the train comes to Milner Road Junction, where the original Manchester and Leeds line, which is now disused for passenger traffic, stretches off eastwards for about 8 miles to Normanton. In the first instance, the Manchester and Leeds Company had bypassed Halifax altogether, but due to its rapidly growing importance as a textile centre, a branch line was opened in 1844. Because of the positioning of the track to Normanton, it was impossible for the trains from Sowerby Bridge to reach Halifax without reversing. This was not at all satisfactory as a working practice, so in 1852 a spur was constructed by Sir John Hawkshaw, a fine engineer who followed in the mould of Stephenson, but was more contemporary with Robert Stephenson and Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The new part of the line crosses the River Calder on a long viaduct, and there's a magnificent panoramic view of the valley before the train disappears underground into the Bankhouse Tunnel. Once out of the tunnel, the train starts to climb again up into the hills before rejoining the original line at Dryclough Junction. This approach to Halifax, just like every other railway route into the town, was a tricky one. Because of the gradient rising to 1 in 118, it was necessary to take the line through a dramatically narrow rock cutting at Dryclough before arriving at the outskirts. The Manchester and Leeds Railway Company did not want to take the line any further, refusing to extend as far as Bradford. They therefore built a terminus at Halifax, for which they had little regard, describing the station as a filthy dog-hole. It was not only the Manchester and Leeds that took a dim view of Halifax and its industrial and polluted landscape. The poet, William Blake, wrote lines that were to become possibly the most famous and quintessentially English of all hymns. Jerusalem, the prerequisite of school assemblies, women's institute meetings, and the last night of the proms. Halifax is thought to have been the inspiration for his description of dark satanic mills of the second verse. Written at a time when the majority of mill workers were being controlled by a mixture of religion, fear and hunger, Blake's ironic words encouraging the masses to strive for the greater good would have been music to the ears of the factory and mill owners. The blackened, smoking landscape and life-sapping working conditions for men, women and children were of little consequence to the majority of those who prospered in their fine houses many miles from the gloomy outlook that had generated their wealth. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did thy countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Halifax has improved over the years, making the most of its location on the edge of the Pennines, and it is now a popular port of call for visitors to the area. As a wool town, Halifax became a major textile centre during the Industrial Revolution, and Peace Hall still stands today, the only surviving cloth auction hall in Britain. Despite the Manchester and Leeds refusal to take the line on to Bradford, there were a number of rival speculators who wanted to take on the venture, and eventually a West Union Railways Company was formed in 1846. The Manchester and Leeds did not escape responsibility quite so easily, however, as just 3 months after formation, the West Union Railway ran into difficulties. forcing the Manchester and Leeds to take over the project. Sir John Hawkshaw was responsible for laying out the line to Bradford, and it was opened in 1850. The ghastly Doghole station was completely demolished, making way for a new Halifax station in 1855. Fortunately for the railway historians, part of the main building, which was designed by William Butterworth, still survives today. Hawkshaw was not faced with an easy task. There were no steep gorges as negotiated by the earlier part of this line, but it was necessary to cross two hills, one after the other, before the steep drop into Bradford. Tunnels were a must, and of the original 7, a mixture of long and short, 6 are still in use today. The first one this train comes to is Beacon Hill, 1,105 yards in length, with an entrance that owes more to a castle for its architecture than any railway construction. Shortly after emerging, the train turns east across Clifton Beck, carried by the magnificent Hall Bottom Viaduct, which stands 114 feet in height. Hawkshaw used an amazing construction technique which combined strength with economy in a manner of compromise that all future railway engineers would need to apply. The next tunnel, the Wyke, measures 1,365 yards, and after the darkness, the railway suddenly re-emerges into rather a different landscape. There's little to see, and the emptiness is a little eerie. This is Low Moor, and although no longer in use, it was once the most important junction on this section of the line. In the 1790s, one of the biggest ironworks in Yorkshire was founded here, and by the time the railway first came, this way it employed 4,000 men. Looking at the undeniable solidity of the countryside around, the fact that Low Moor iron was famous for its strength the world over doesn't come as a great surprise. Low Moor was also a meeting point for two other lines, the Lancashire and Yorkshire from Mirfield and the Great Northern from Pudsey. It was here that trains from Manchester were split, with the front portion going on to Leeds and the rear section making its way to Bradford. This practice continued for a number of years with all traffic, but as they got faster, the task was performed before the trains left Halifax. Up until the 1880s, the Lancashire and Yorkshire services had a dreadful reputation for lack of punctuality, and for any passenger caught here in the cold, waiting for the Leeds and Bradford train to come, must have been most uncomfortable. There was nothing for them at Low Moor, unlike the station at Mirfield, which even provided a billiard room for passengers who were delayed. After Low Moor, the train turns due north and into the 1,648-yard Bowling Tunnel, before descending at a gradient of 150 into Bradford. At Mill Lane Junction, the Great Northern Line comes in from Leeds, though thankfully the rather revolting and foul-smelling tunnel underneath Wakefield Road has now gone, as well as a level crossing at Mill Lane. As a city, Bradford is modern in appearance, predominantly due to the fact that when the woolen industry collapsed, it needed to reinvent itself. This has proved successful in many ways, with the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television built in 1983, proving to be a fine example, enjoying the status of being the most visited museum outside London. For many railway enthusiasts, the loss of Bradford's exchange station is a tragedy, and the small, modern, uninteresting concrete replacement is little consolation. The only redeeming feature is perhaps the fact that it has been combined with the town's bus station and has been given the appropriate name of interchange, making it the undisputed centre for public transport. This is a formula that many future town and city planners may need to consider if they wish to encourage more environmentally friendly city centres. Before dismissing Bradford, though, as lacking any railway buildings of note, the traveller should take the time to visit the Victoria Hotel, which used to face the old station forecourt. The construction of railway hotels was an important source of additional revenue for the railway companies, and Victoria was a valuable part of Great Northern's empire. Although it was built independently, the Great Northern bought it in 1893, and the hotel remained in railway ownership until 1952. There's been an undoubted atmosphere of industrial gloom about sections of this journey from Manchester, and more often than not, the modern-day attempts to generate new business into the area have failed, leaving buildings boarded up and in varying states of disrepair. Hopefully, though, this journey will also have highlighted some of the great natural beauty and dramatic examples of industrial architecture that are scattered over this sometimes inhospitable landscape. Having travelled to Bradford and seen the disappointing modern interchange station, it may appear that this journey is ending on a down note. But a short detour beyond the city centre will find the wonderful and very unexpected village of Saltaire. The railway to Keighley, home of the Steam Society viewed earlier, passes close by after following the Leeds and Liverpool Canal northwards out of Bradford. To say that Saltaire is a mill village grown out of the Industrial Revolution would be true, but misleading, because the first site of the Italian Renaissance buildings carefully laid out in the heart of the Yorkshire countryside certainly comes as rather a pleasant surprise. The village was built by Sir Titus Salt between 1852 and 1877, and he was one of the few mill owners of the northern textile industry to make careful provision for the workers he employed. Salt's mill was built in the style of an Italian palazzo, and it was even larger than St. Paul's Cathedral, as well as being the largest textile mill in the world. Evidently, he was concerned with the moral welfare of his workers, because he placed his beautiful Italian-looking church, now Bradford's United Reformed Church, directly outside his factory gates. Saltaire covers 25 acres, made up of 900 buildings contained in 22 streets. Most of the streets are named after members of the Salt family. It is also interesting to note that the 1853 gallery in the heart of the village contains the biggest collection of David Hockney paintings, a modern bespectacled icon who is one of Bradford's most famous sons. And what of the famous father and son who were responsible for the development of the railway, and more particularly the course of the journey taken today? For George Stephenson, his involvement with the Manchester and Leeds Railway was one of his last great works. The practical application of engineering skills to a particular problem, in this case crossing the Pennines, was what Stephenson was so very good at. Throughout this programme, comparisons have arisen between the Stephensons and the Brunels as the two great engineering families of the railway age. It's been said that the Stephensons were inventive, practical and sagacious, with the Brunels being ingenious, imaginative and daring. This railway journey today would certainly confirm the validity of such a statement, because despite the mountainous nature of certain sections of the journey, there's not a moment when the passenger feels the slightest concern for their safety. Comforting as this may be, perhaps by today's standards there could be room for just a little more daring. History recognises George Stephenson, and he knew himself that locomotive power would bring with it dramatic change, saying these words before he presented his case. "Gentlemen, I will do something in coming time which will astonish all England." This he certainly did, but just as Isambard Kingdom Brunel had found, much to his disappointment, the recognition for engineering achievements rarely followed, despite the often Herculean effort it had taken to bring them about. Brunel's grandfather had given a warning to this effect, predicting with remarkable but metaphorical accuracy that his son and grandson would benefit the world and yet starve themselves. George Stephenson was financially secure, and there was never any threat of starvation. But when he died in August 1848 at the age of 68, there was no grand funeral or monument erected to mark his place of burial. He was quietly laid to rest with his second wife, Elizabeth, at Holy Trinity Church, Chesterfield. By contrast, his son Robert, whom he had taught everything he knew, was buried with all ceremony in Westminster Abbey. Queen Victoria was asked for her permission to allow the funeral cortege through Hyde Park, which she readily agreed, acknowledging the high position and worldwide reputation that Mr. Stephenson had won for himself as an engineer, and also commenting on the loss that the country had sustained as a result of his death. Robert Stephenson only outlived his father by 11 years. He may have received the public acclaim that his father had deserved, but his health was destroyed by the high-powered and stressful nature of the work that completely dominated his life. Whatever the future holds for the railways of Great Britain, this journey from Manchester to Bradford will always offer a unique view of early railway construction, and the remarkable achievements of the many thousands of skilled men who risked their lives to bring transport to this remarkable area. Without George Stephenson, however, the development of the railways may well have taken many more years to come to fruition. Thanks to his practical, no-nonsense approach and his ability to get the project completed in the most efficient manner possible, the industrial regions of the north of England were able to transport their wares to the rest of the world, bringing a prosperity to the north which is sadly missed today. Perhaps the last words in this programme should be left to George Stephenson, and a reply by letter to a young man who had asked for advice about becoming an engineer. They sum up the man and his life's work perfectly. I am a plain-spoken person, and am sorry to see a nice-looking and rather clever young man like you disfigured with that fine patterned waistcoat and all those chains and fang-dangs. If I, sir, had bothered my head with such things at your age, I would not have been where I am now.